I have homework, but I should probably do. So. We shall do that. Hopefully they are going to cancel this. She texted me and said that they were going to go back to Friday. What did he say?
Okay. I'm just trying to find a way to get you and the screen in the same shot.
Okay, you tell me where.
Well, I managed to do it before. We'll just
I don't think so.
I feel like we should. They're going to start in the fall.
I would love that. I mean, like, just like after class, like, oh, we're having a lecture on this. You can come if you want.
Yeah.
Like, in Toronto, I feel like that'd be fun.
Yeah.
Maybe that's just me. I don't know.
No, it's especially fun for us because we don't usually get to talk about what we'd like to talk about. I mean, not that we don't like to talk about what we teach, but
It can only cover so much.
right, right. And this is more just like a conversation where I get to be like, look, this is crazy, as opposed to like, all right, this is on the test, right? You know?
I have heard a lot of interesting things that I did not know before your class. In your class.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
You're in people and cultures, is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Because I also have interest in geography in the same class on a different day, so I was like thinking, yes.
Yes.
Isn't it?
Do you know Dr. Baton?
Uh-huh.
Okay.
So whatever you do, stay between the podium and this screen.
Okay, don't go anywhere else.
Okay. So, I was asking you about a cherry coke. Do you want one? Okay. We don't have any. And you don't carry the nice cherry coke. Is your partner? Okay. You do have the coke. You have coke, but it's never flavored. But it's also the full size can. That's true. We have the baby cans. The baby cans of Sprite, or sometimes you get 7-Up, which is confusing. Yeah. Like, why would you get 7-Up from Sprite? That doesn't make sense.
These screens are so big. Are they? I don't think they're much bigger than the ones downstairs and oh, there's next on. Maybe I guess we only have one and 117 versus
That one is really small.
okay. I was gonna say when I stand in front of it, I don't normally see the like it's a movie.
The most practical communication out there. Like, grade change. Blah, 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 history of that. Yeah. Was it good? Was it bad? What's happening? When they put in an answer, it has to be like specific to what they typed. If you do it wrong, you don't capitalize it. Kind of wrong. So my modern literature teacher always has to go back and rephrase them. So we constantly get the original grade notifications and then the rechanged grade. I know, but like I mean, I guess there's no way around it. So turn off notifications. Well, that I meant like there isn't really a way around this. I mean, you could just. Well, no, the specifics of like the way the test grades. I know. You know. Yeah. Yeah.
You see me with my phone in the middle, it's because I'm live tweeting. It's not
There you
because
go.
I am not one of those people who have my phone out during lecture.
Did you say on the whole historians are a paper reading or an off the cuff?
We did both.
Okay.
Most of us started out one way and then it ended up.
Right. Yeah, I went back and watched. Oh, I sure as I watched Colossus. I watched a bunch of people's and I wasn't sure if that was like a.
Our conferences, we tend to read, yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Because
Well,
we
it's
use our
also-
conferences for sort of peer review of our argument.
Gotcha.
So you can't really go off the cuff. You have to go with what you're going to publish.
Right. So people can really critique it. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay.
One of the things we do is we start introducing what the archive opportunity is
Mm-hmm.
and why we're doing this, and then going into
Perfect.
a little bit. So,
I have a little slide about it actually.
oh, look at
And how geographers have actually studied teach-ins before.
Oh.
Just a smidge. Since I am the inaugural geographer in the series, I feel like I needed
Oh,
to.
indeed, indeed.
So that history and political science, is that it so far?
Casey, criminology.
Oh, right, okay, okay,
She'll close it out.
gotcha.
I've gotten several emails from other faculty who want to participate in the fall.
Cool.
So I think we're going to have faculty from recreation
Okay,
doing topics on social justice, which should be interesting. So,
interesting.
yeah.
So is that what you meant by like in the fall there'll be other, oh,
Yeah.
okay, okay.
It'll take some of the pressure off of us to feel like we have to do it, but at the same time, I want to give the folks that haven't done it yet the opportunity.
Right,
So,
yeah, there's only so many of us, so can't keep it up forever.
yeah. I think a lot of the more senior folks are letting the younger folks go first, because none of our full professors have gone yet.
I would love to hear Ryan talk about his work.
Oh, you can hear Brian all the time. He presents at a lot of our international stuff.
Okay.
Yeah, very lively. Just be careful if you end up having a class next door to his. That's all I gotta say.
His students love him. I teach after him twice, and I come in and I've started trying to give him more margin because like I used to come in at like 53, 54, you know, and the students are still up there asking him questions, and like my students are just like, oh, thanks, like leave, you know, like he's got like a mob of people up there like, Dr. Hess, tell me more about this.
Yeah, he's very dynamic in the classroom.
Mm.
Very lively, engaging. He doesn't have that monotone voice.
Mm-hmm.
So, and then he does the occasional whoop whoop cowabunga scream in the class, and God help you if you have an exam the next door.
There you go. You know, we do like reverse, like peer evaluation of the junior faculty, but I think we should get a chance to run around and like watch other people's classes just to like
You can.
learn and see how.
I mean, you totally can. I mean, technically speaking, even the senior faculty have to go through peer observation. They just only have to do it every 3 years.
I would love to get to just kind of pop in and see other people's teaching styles and stuff. Cool.
Yeah. I've thought of doing like pocket cohort groups where there's one from each discipline in a group and they all watch each other's classes.
I think
And
that'd be
then have a work group kind of thing, but trying to get anybody to agree to do anything right now in COVID. So we'll just stick to our common read.
Yeah, yeah.
Seems to be working. And on that note, I'm gonna go live. So
Okay.
here we go. Maybe. Okay, for some reason it is not, it's recording, but it's not showing live.
sat too long. Let me. Please pause for station.
Calm before the storm. I feel like everybody got really quiet.
And we're live.
Ready to go? Excellent. Well, welcome to Occupy Vault. Thank you all very much for being here. I mean that sincerely. I really appreciate you all showing up. I know some of you are currently my students, and I'm bribing you with bonus points to be here today, but thank you for being here. And also thanks to those of you who don't have to be here but chose to come instead. So I want to introduce myself. My name is Emily Frazier, and I am an assistant professor of geography here in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences. So this is my first year at Northwest. And I am really excited to be participating in our Occupy Vault series today. We started this as a department last fall. The historians really kind of carried the ball for the department and got together over the summer, just in light of everything that was happening in 2020, especially in light of the racial injustices and different protests around social justice, different things that were happening last summer. Really wanted to kind of consider, what is our role as educators? How can we, or how can they as historians and we as a whole department speak to some of what's happening and use our training and our insight to try to inform and see what's going on, speak to our current context. So I am the first geographer to speak in our series. I'm excited about that. Hopefully I will be able to make some good points for why geography matters. And tonight I'm going to be talking to you about refugees, refuge, and the geographies of exclusion. But first, I'd like to offer a reflection on the purpose of this series, like reflect on Occupy Vault and why we're doing this from a geographic perspective. So as I said, beginning in August of last year, the historians of our department began a series in response to growing protests and social justice movements addressing race, inequality, and exclusion in the United States. Together, these talks have sought to expose the embedded and contextualized nature of our discriminatory practices, policies, and realities, and to place these events in their current historical, social, and if I may, geographic context, okay? So nearly 56 years ago, actually, in March of 1956, the very first teach-in was held at the University of Michigan in response to the Vietnam War. And if I can figure out how to use my laser pointer, I will gesture you there to a photo representing that. Now, ironically, actually, in reference to my topic of my talk today, one of the many unexpected outcomes from the Vietnam War was a government-sponsored resettlement of nearly 125,000 Vietnamese refugees into the US after the fall of Saigon in 1975. This was a massive movement of people that actually led to the establishment of what is now known as the 1980 Refugee Act, which officially kickstarted our modern resettlement program. So it's all linked, okay? But at this time, these teach-ins were directed at protesting the war policies surrounding that war. and intended to express peaceful protests, right? This teaching was the result of faculty's desires to express their frustration and catalyze awareness among undergraduate students. And this resulted not just in one teach-in, not just in one short lecture, but in a series of lectures, seminars, panels, workshops that actually lasted all night. Doesn't that sound fun? Okay, so this year at Northwest, we've adopted the term teach-in to describe our Occupy Volk series, although we are not adopting their time schedule, do not worry. I plan to respect our time here this evening. We will not be staying all night, okay? But I've pulled enough all-nighters, so. This series does, however, build on these original teach-ins legacy, because we as scholars and educators believe that the power of education, dialogue, and knowledge, it has power to change us, and thereby affect change in the world. Similar to the famous sit-ins and other protests across the US during the civil rights movement, the teach-in demonstrates the occupation of space as a point of protest, an expression of resistance, and an embodied statement of conviction. So as a geographer, I'm just gonna take this moment to make some geographical points. I would be remiss not to point out the crucial role of space in some of these forms of protest. Referencing some of these photos, okay? These people are occupying, literally, with their bodies, physically, spaces that they were not supposed to be, spaces which they had no right to be in, right? This represents a rupture in the normal, expected spatial norms, right? It's weird to see students sitting on the floor, crammed into a classroom, in a class building at night. What's up with that, right? It's weird to see Black Americans, right, sitting at a counter marked whites only. They're occupying that space with their bodies as a form of protest, right? Weird to see people sitting in the wrong section of the bus, right? All of these forms of protest are forms of space, expressing power and protest through space. And geographers have made important contributions to our understandings of the importance and the power of space, place, and territory. Based on the power of these spatial protests, we can see how understanding geography is central to our understandings of social life. This brings me back to the topic of tonight's talk, which is, don't bring me you're tired, you're poor, Geographies of Exclusion and the Erosion of Refuge. As we walk through the issues presented tonight, I'd like us to hold this thought in the forefront of our minds. How does geography matter? Namely, how do we see the control of space, territory, the location or place of certain activities, and the geographic proximity surface in this story that I'm about to tell. So now, without further ado, let's begin the real portion of the talk. Not like the brazen giant of Greek fame, with conquering limbs astride from land to land, here at our sea-washed sunset gates shall stand a mighty woman with a torch, whose flame is the imprisoned lightning, and her name is Mother of Exiles. From her beacon hand glows worldwide welcome. Her mild eyes command the air-bridged harbor that twin cities frame. Keep, ancient lands, your storied pomp, cries she with silent lips. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, tempest-tossed, to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. You may recognize these lines from Emma Lazarus's famous poem, The New Colossus, inspired by the sight of the new Statue of Liberty rising above New York Harbor. Now, this famous statue was a gift from the nation of France, originally intended to celebrate the end of the Civil War and the abolition of slavery in the US, as well as to serve as a reminder of France and America's longstanding friendship. Now, this history of the statue is nearly forgotten. In fact, I'm not sure if I just wasn't paying attention in history class or if no one told me. But I did not know, in fact, that the original designs of the Statue of Liberty included her holding aloft in one of her hands broken shackles and chains to represent the abolition of slavery. Now, in our modern context, the statue has become more and more associated with immigration, and so this other history has been lost. However, if you see, I did include some of these photos here on the top and bottom side. You can actually see the chains and the broken shackle at her feet, which still speaks to that original intent. Now, Emma Lazarus, herself a Jewish American, was a poet and social activist involved in volunteer work for refugees living in New York City in the 1880s. She was also involved in aiding Russian Jews in seeking refuge in the United States. When asked to write a poem as part of an arts festival that was intended to raise funds to construct the pedestal of the Statue of Liberty, she created the new Colossus. Immigration and the freedom of the oppressed was very much on her mind at this time. The resulting work became iconic, transforming the meaning of the statue over time to symbolize immigration and the opportunity of America for the more than 23.5 million immigrants who arrived in New York Harbor over the next 40 years. Today, for some people, for most people, I would say, the Statue of Liberty symbolizes America's promise of liberty, of welcome, and legacy of immigration, right? And Lazarus's words are often invoked to support policies and positions in favor of immigration, speaking to our history as a diverse nation of immigrants. In August 2019, these famous words were invoked again, although in a twisted way, by Ken Cuccinelli, who at the time was the acting director of USCIS, Citizen and Immigration Services. When asked by a reporter about the newly implemented changes to US immigration policy designed to limit legal immigration, Cuccinelli made the following statement: "Give me your tired and your poor who can stand on their own 2 feet and will not become a public charge." Also adding later, "This is part of President Trump keeping his promises. I mean, this is not new or a surprise." As Cuccinelli notes in this exchange, the 2019 policy change was not new. It was not a surprise. In fact, former President Trump has been explicit about his views on immigration from his candidacy through his administration. Now, while the US immigration system is complex and the changes made over the past 4 years have had many different effects, tonight we're going to focus in on one area and one type of migrant, and that is refugees and resettlement. So please don't hear me saying that what I'm saying tonight is all of the story, right? We're just kind of focusing in on one category. Now, I want to give us a little bit of heads up about where we're going. We're going to first look into some of those recent policy reversals that have taken place in the US, specifically around refugees and asylum seekers. We used to be the largest resettlement program in the world. Now the US has decreased its resettlement to the lowest in history. We'll also look back a little bit at the history of the word refugee and where these ideas and rules around refugees came from. And we'll look to current realities that highlight the ongoing use of geography to exclude. Finally, we'll consider some examples, not just from the US, but from around the world that highlight the ongoing erosion of refuge. So to understand the recent erosion of refuge in the US and across the world, I'm going to take us back to 2011, which doesn't seem that long ago to me, but it was a decade ago, okay? So in March 2011, the conflict now known as the Syrian Civil War began. What began as anti-government protests quickly devolved into a multi-sided and deadly conflict, and the country of Syria descended into a deadly civil war. A decade later, still today, that war is ongoing. More than 12 million Syrians have been displaced as a result of the violence, and today Syrians constitute the single largest origin refugee population in the world. These displaced persons initially moved around within their own country seeking safety without crossing a border, but soon as the conflict dragged on, more and more Syrians were displaced and Syrians began to leave their country, joining other migrants on the path to Europe. Beginning in 2014, there was a noticeable uptick in the number of migrants, Syrian and otherwise, okay, who began arriving in the EU seeking asylum. In 2015 alone, 1 year, an estimated 1 million migrants arrived in Europe by sea, crossing the Mediterranean Sea, and nearly 35,000 by land. As these numbers increased, European concern began to rise, leading to increased media attention to what in the US and in the EU has been termed the European refugee crisis. Now, I want to give a content warning about some of the photos and the slides that are going to come up. Some of these photos may be upsetting and depict some of the things that have happened and deaths in the Mediterranean. The sheer volume of migration was accompanied by the expansion of increasingly risky travel routes as migrants set out for Europe by any means possible. In the Mediterranean alone, thousands of migrants died in their attempt to cross the sea to seek asylum. On September 2nd, 2015, A young Syrian boy and his family boarded a small inflatable boat and set out for Greece. Tragically, a few hours into the journey, the boat capsized, leading to the deaths of Alan, Ghalib, and their mother, Rihanna. This photo, which this is actually a mural based on the photo, of Alan Kurdi's body on the shores of Greece went viral, becoming a global icon of the Syrian refugee crisis and the international community's failed response. This instantly began to provoke international outcry, raising awareness and humanitarian concern. In a speech to the United Nations later that same month, then President Barack Obama invoked that photo, that image of Alan Kurdi, urging world leaders to cooperate to find solutions to the refugee crisis, and pledging that the US would accept an additional 10,000 Syrian refugees in that fiscal year. Now, other countries followed suit, yet not 2 months later, the November 2015 terrorist attacks in Paris stoked concerns that incoming Syrian migrants may pose security threats or have ISIS affiliations. Within days, governors in 30 states across the US issued firm statements opposing the resettlement of Syrian refugees in their states. Tensions high, immigration, the issue of refugee resettlement suddenly became central issues in the then ongoing presidential primary race. Refugee resettlement in particular becomes politicized at this point like never before in US history. And I'll say as an aside, refugee resettlement historically has been the safe immigration topic. These are people who are persecuted, they're fleeing war, and so historically in the US, the question of whether or not to help and resettle refugees has been more one of a humanitarian concern than one of a migration or security concern. And so in 2015, 2016, we see a very subtle but important shift where refugees move away from being a humanitarian concern and all of a sudden become considered a threat. All right. So opposition to immigration and refugee resettlement became central planks in the Trump campaign platform. Once elected, President Trump issued a series of executive orders on immigration that, among other things, suspended the US refugee resettlement program and slashed admissions in half. With each subsequent year, the administration successively lowered admission ceilings, decreasing arrivals to historically low levels. And by October 2020, the admission ceiling set for 2021 was marked at 15,000 refugees, which is the lowest level ever set in the history of the United States since the modern reception system was put in place. This pullback from resettlement and increased concerns about security was not limited to the US, however. Globally, resettlement numbers in many different countries of the global north started to fall in 2017. Border security intensified, more walls went up, less asylum claims were granted. In fact, in 2018, USA Today reported that around the world, 77 new border walls have been put up since September 11th, 2001. Clearly, this is a bigger story than just the Syrian refugee crisis, the US resettlement system, or even the policies of former President Trump. I just want to go back actually for a second. Shouldn't have hidden it. Okay, this right here, I'm just going to take a moment. This is my personal favorite. Okay, has anybody heard of Brexit before? All right. Okay, so Brexit was, it also took place in 2016, where the UK voted to leave the EU. The United Kingdom said we don't want to be part of the EU anymore. And one of the central kind of issues at stake was the fact that they wanted to control their own borders. Okay, it was related to the securitization of migration and concern. And this was a photo. Okay, this is Nigel Farage. Okay, he was part of the Leave campaign. And this is one of his famous posters that he put up, okay, to vote, that people should vote to leave. My favorite thing about this, okay, this photo is from Hungary. Okay, it is not even from the UK. It's from a region dozens of countries away. My other favorite thing about this, okay, we see people walking, right? The UK is an island. You cannot walk to the UK, right? I guess you could maybe, like, I don't know, take a truck through the channel or something, okay? But this whole imagery, this whole marching hordes of people coming to invade your island is just geographically very silly, right? You can't walk to the the UK. Anyways, we'll move on. Lost my spot in my rage. Okay. All right, so at this moment in history, global levels of displacement are higher than they ever have been since the aftermath of World War II. In fact, every time I give a talk or write a paper, I go to update these numbers, okay? And they have been record-breaking for every successive year since 2014. Today, the total figure of displacement, whoops, pushed the wrong button, stands at this staggering figure of 79.5 million forcibly displaced people. That is a larger number of people than the population of many countries, okay? Massive numbers of people. And these numbers are actually from the end of 2019 because of the pandemic. UNHCR, which is the international body that counts these things, has had trouble updating their statistics. So now at this point, if you're like me, you're probably thinking, why are things this way? How did this happen? And what can be done? To begin answering these questions, we need to go back into history and do a quick recap. Now, I always get anxious when I have to talk about history in front of a historian because inevitably I have to gloss over some things, okay? So I beg forgiveness from any history buffs in the room. I'm hitting some high points, okay? And here, this is outside of my personal subject area. So I want to credit, I'm going to draw on and briefly synthesize the work of excellent migration historian Peter Guttrell, okay? He specializes in this. So this is drawing on his work. So forced migration and displacement, as we've been discussing, is not a new phenomenon. Although the word refugee, and the way we treat it today, are relatively recent modern interventions. But the first English use of the word refugee can be traced to the persecution of the French Huguenots, okay? A Protestant group that was persecuted by the French Catholic government in the 16th and 17th centuries. Guttrell and other scholars who study this history trace the emergence of our modern definition of refugee to two main things. Number one, the emergence of the nation state in Europe, and number two, to the aftermath of World Wars I and II. As the Russian, Austro-Hungarian, and Ottoman empires began to decline and fall in this period, new nation states began to emerge on the European landscape. As the political formation of the nation state matured and developed, questions started to arise, like who belongs in this country? Who is part of our nation? What does it mean to be part of this polity, this country, this nation? And on what basis does someone get to be part of my country? All of these issues began to crystallize at this time. Now, after World War I, we see the issue, the word refugee, the issue of refugees began to emerge as a category of concern, as thousands upon thousands are displaced from their former homelands, driven out by violence or the dramatic political reorganization of large parts of Europe at this time. Later, in the 1940s, we begin to see an acceleration of this trend as millions of people are displaced in Europe, both from World War II and the Spanish Civil War. Now, the newly formed United Nations at this time tackles the ongoing task of managing all of this displacement. This leads to the creation of what's known as the 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees. Now, this document, from here forth, I will just call the convention because that name is too long, okay? So the convention, it formalized the definition of refugee, which we actually see here. We'll talk about that in just a second. And it also requires that all states, all countries that sign on to the convention must provide protection and refuge for anyone who asks, all right? They sign on to the law, they have to play by the rules of the law, right? Make sense? So today we have 145 countries around the world that are signatories to the convention and its later amendment called the protocol, meaning that they are accountable to the provisions of this agreement and must provide refuge to those seeking it. Now, I want to highlight one important element of this agreement. It's the principle of non-refoulement, okay? It's a French word, if you couldn't guess, and I don't speak French, so apologies to all French people there, but this is an important word, okay? This word means no country may forcibly return someone to a country where their life is in danger or they are in danger of being persecuted, all right? So there's two sides to this. If you sign the convention, you have to offer refuge and you cannot send people back to where they're in danger, okay? Remember that. Now, the 1951 convention only applied to refugees in Europe. So there was a geographical constraint, and it also only applied to people who were displaced as a direct result of World War II. There's a time and a geography constraint. Remember that. We'll come back to that, okay? Now, how does all this history help us understand the state we're in today, you might be asking. So let's think about the geographic context in which the 1951 convention emerged. In Europe, in the aftermath of World War II. Now, I mentioned just a moment ago, the 1967 version amended the temporal and geographic constraints of the refugee protections. Okay? Before then, only people in Europe, only people from World War II. After 1967, they took those away and they said, this refugee definition can be applied to anybody, anywhere, at any time who meets these criteria. All right? For those history buffs in the room, you may remember that at the same time that Europe is recovering from World War II and experiencing all this displacement, there were actually tens of millions of other people in other regions all across the globe who were also facing forcible displacement and persecution, yet were not protected under these laws. For example, just a quick rundown, the Japanese invasion of China, followed by the Chinese Civil War, coupled with the 1947 partition of India. What about the 1948 creation of the State of Israel and displacement of millions of Palestinians? Many other ongoing conflicts at this time created millions of would-be refugees in need of protection. However, for several decades thereafter, there was no framework to accommodate for their protection in international law. From its beginning, our modern system of refugee protection has been Eurocentric, meaning centered on Europe, made because of European problems, and mostly applying to Europeans. Now you might say, well, what about later? They expanded it. More countries joined the UN. That doesn't sound like the geographies of exclusion to me, okay? You're right. But let's not be too hasty. Let's look at where we're at today, because geography still matters. Where are the majority of people in the world today who are experiencing displacement? This is the interactive portion. Let's look at this map together. These are the top 10 refugee-producing countries as of the middle of last year. What do you notice about some of these regional concentrations? Any patterns? I see a lot of countries in Africa. There's Syria, right? Afghanistan, Myanmar, and Venezuela, right? Horrible tragedies going on there. What do we notice about none of these countries that are, or let me rephrase, what do we not see on this map? Europe, or hiding, not even on the map. The North America is just over there like, oh, we're not here, don't worry about us, right? Okay, now, what's the point I'm making? Most of the people in the world are coming from conflicts in the global south, okay? Not the most developed, established countries of the north. And many of these countries that are hosting these refugees are also not in the global north. Amnesty International has made a couple of graphics about this. I want to focus on this one over here. That's a map. These are our top refugee hosting countries as of last year. And again, we see those hosting countries that are bearing the burden and the responsibility of protecting people are mostly also in the global south. Lebanon, Jordan, right? Turkey, neighbors of Syria, Iran, Pakistan, neighbor of Afghanistan, Sudan, and also Kenya, I bet would be close up on this map, right? Colombia, it's not showing us there, but we know Colombia is right next to Venezuela, right? It's the countries that geographically are closest to refugee-producing places that end up bearing the brunt and the bulk of the cost and responsibility of protecting people who are in need of refuge today. More and more today, the wealthiest countries in the world take drastic actions to protect their borders, prevent migrants from entering their territory. We don't even want them to set their foot here, because if they did, we would be required under international law to hear their case and offer them asylum. They're slowing or completely slashing resettlement slots, spending fortunes on high-tech security to patrol their borders, building detention centers offshore, processing facilities, all to prevent those seeking refuge from ever entering their borders. So we're going to look at a couple of examples. We see the erosion of refuge, unfortunately, in many places. And I could probably teach a whole class just on these examples, okay? But I'm going to try to make it brief. First, let's talk about Australia, our southern cousin, okay? Now, Australia has the advantage geographically of being an island. What do I mean by advantage? As I mentioned with the UK, right? Nobody can walk to Australia. They don't have Syrians walking through Turkey to get there, right? And they're pretty far away from other stuff, meaning a raft is probably not going to get you there, okay? So they have a little bit of geography protecting them, in a sense, right, from unwanted asylum seekers just popping up in their borders. And yet, look at these. What are these blue circles? This map is showing us the locations of where Australia processes their asylum seekers and resettlement requests, okay? Instead of allowing people into their territory, they warehouse and detain asylum seekers offshore. And in fact, most of these islands don't even belong to Australia. Manus Island, Nauru, Christmas Island, they are leasing, they're paying other countries to lease some of their extra islands to build a prison on to hold their asylum seekers there while they wait to see if they're going to give those people asylum or not. And I will tell you, unfortunately, people stay in those detention centers for years and years while the slow bureaucratic grind of the asylum processing system grinds on, okay? This photo right here is taken by Human Rights Watch from Nauru, okay? This is a detention center over here. If you look in the background, I know it's kind of hard to see because of the contrast, but I'm seeing a lot of barbed wire. I'm seeing excessively high fences. I'm seeing tent buildings, okay? And right now they're engaged in a protest, okay? The people that are being detained in Nauru and Christmas Island and these other places are protesting, saying, we know our rights. We know what international law says. We have the right for you to hear our asylum case. And in fact, you are not allowed to detain us while you are processing our asylum request, okay? And yet this persists. And unfortunately, the psychological conditions on some of these detention centers are so horrific. People have begun self-immolating as a form of protest, meaning they set themselves on fire, decide it would be better to risk their lives to make a statement and potentially die than to continue living like this. Imagine how bad this must be to drive people, not just one person, multiple people, to that. Let's look at another example. Europe. All right, so we could talk about this all day, but Europe has some fancy little border things going on to keep people from ever getting there. First, I want to draw your attention to this photo here on the left-hand side of the screen. This is a border guard, a European border guard from an agency called Frontex. Isn't that a great name? Frontex. Okay. Now, the EU, if you're not familiar with what that is, it's a coalition of European states that jump together and they pool some of their financial resources, they share some economic policy, and most of them share policing of their borders, okay? So we have this really robust Frontex agency. If I were to show you reports of the growth of Frontex in the last 5 years, you would be shocked. Frontex didn't exist 15 years ago, and today they are balling with a massive budget and really tripped out boats, cool little arm patches, okay? Here we see a Frontex border guard engaging on the coast with a migrant boat of asylum seekers, all right? And repeatedly, we're hearing reports from several different areas in the Mediterranean that the Italian Coast Guard and Frontex are letting people drown. They'll be out patrolling, a boat will go down, and they will refuse to rescue them. Now let's think about this. Why might that be? If you've never thought about it before, or if you're not a Navy person, not a boat person, you may not know that a boat owned by the Navy or the Coast Guard actually counts as sovereign territory of the nation of which commissioned that boat. So if they were to rescue an asylum seeker and bring them onto their boat, well, there it goes. We just triggered that territorial geographic clause in the refugee protection. You have to offer them asylum. Now, I'm not saying that Italian Coast Guard is always doing this, okay? Thankfully, these reports are less common, okay? This is not the norm, but we still see these reports, right? Again, we see in Greece, migrant pushbacks, where they send Frontex out into territorial waters. They're like, no, we're not gonna, you're not drowning, we're not gonna not rescue you, but we're going to send you home. We're not gonna let you even enter the territorial waters of Greece because you might actually wash up on our shore, and we can't have that, okay? Externalization, using geography to exclude, and the erosion of the principle of refuge. Last example. Now, I've talked a bit about US resettlement, right, and how that was slashed and undermined in the last 4 years of the presidential administration. But the US also practices sort of border externalization processes. If you've been following the news recently, you may know about this. The Remain in Mexico program was a program put forth by the Trump administration, which said basically, we don't want to keep asylum seekers in our territory. We can't deal with them. We got in trouble when we kept them in cages. That wasn't good for PR. And so we don't have the facilities to detain them here because that's just inconvenient. We can't let them go. And so we're going to pay Mexico to detain them there. All right. That's an oversimplification, but that's the gist. Okay. And of course, that was a contested policy in the courts, advocates, others saying, people cannot live like this. This is against the principle of non-refoulement. You can't send people back across the border. And it's also against the idea that countries that sign on to that convention, that international law, are required to assess people's cases and to ask and to provide for them while people are in the asylum process. This is a clear violation of that. All right, so I could go on. I could give a lot more examples, but I'm going to stop there, and I want to pose a couple of questions to us. The state of things, all right? Are displacement numbers accelerating? The offer of refuge eroding around the globe has led some scholars to say, oh, our modern system of refugee protection has failed. But I ask you tonight, has it failed? Or is it functioning as it was designed? I look at our system of refugee protection and the international laws we have in place today and the history of them, and I ask myself, who were these made for? Who were these systems made for? Whose continent was in shambles when these were made? And today, who are these laws really protecting? Are they protecting the vulnerable? Are they protecting the people in the global south who've been displaced and are being warehoused and hosted in countries that don't have the resources to do so? To close, I want to read an excerpt from a really excellent book that, plug, I will be referencing in my class in the fall, called Forced Migration and Displacement, which if you found any of this interesting, you may want to consider taking. Zygmunt Bauman is a famous sociologist who has been around a long time. And he wrote this whole book in 2016 in response to the Syrian refugee crisis called Strangers at Our Door. And I want to read this quote because I think it speaks to why we get so riled up about refugees and asylum seekers. He says, speaking of refugees, they make us aware and keep reminding us of what we would dearly like to forget, or better still, wish away. They remind us of some global, distant, occasionally heard about, but mostly unseen, intangible, obscure, mysterious, and not easy to imagine forces. These nomads, he's talking about refugees, not by choice, but by the verdict of a heartless fate, remind us irritatingly, infuriatingly, and horrifyingly of the incurable vulnerability of our own position and of the endemic fragility of our hard-won well-being. Like the protests over racial injustice of the past summer, even like the coronavirus pandemic itself, there are some things that come around and remind us that we are not invincible. And moreover, we're not alone. No man is an island. We're all connected. The plight of refugees reminds us that we're all connected, we're all implicated. And yes, even in this room, we are all human and vulnerable. But for a twist of fate, but for the grace of God, that could be any of us. We don't get to decide where we're born. We don't control when disasters strike. Civil War descends. What happens when the doors of refuge are closed and it's your turn to need it? Geography reminds us that we're all on the same planet. We only have one, and we're all in this together. Thank you. Any questions?
I have one, because I always do.
Yeah.
Do you see any parallels between Emma Lazarus's poem on the Statue of Liberty and the poem read by Amanda Gorman at Biden's inauguration?
Yes. Yes, and I don't have it memorized and I don't have it in front of me, but I do, when she was giving that poem, I remember thinking like, this is because it envisions a future that is not yet, but invokes the ideal of what the writer thinks America should be. And so, yeah, I definitely see that. It's so beautiful. I love her. Other questions? Yeah.
You talked about how refugees and like displaced peoples used to be more of like a humanitarian issue that people talked about. Why do you think has it become more of a political issue within the last 10 years, like 10, 15 years?
That's an excellent question, and one that I was trying to not dive too deep into this so we wouldn't be here for 3 hours, but I'll try to give you a short answer on some of those reasons. Since 2001, since the 9/11 attacks, especially in the US and in Europe, there has been like a heightened association of Islam and Arabs and people from Arabic or Muslim majority countries with terrorism, right? This kind of increased association. And so there are some scholars that take the view, well, Syria is a majority Muslim country, people in Syria are Arabs, and so when we all of a sudden see this mass displacement of 12 million of them fleeing around the world, people in the West go, because we have over time racialized and started to think of Arabs as a threat. So that's one line of thinking. Another line is, right, we do see, unfortunately, like for instance, the 2015 Paris attacks. Okay, there were some terrorists who bombed the theater and perpetrated some other terrorist attacks in Paris. One of them had a Syrian passport. Now, it turned out later that was fake. Okay, but the possibility introduced this idea where all of a sudden everyone in Europe was like, those Syrian passports could be letting in terrorists. Okay, so there's kind of that idea as well. But I think in sometimes certain issues just coalesce and certain political cycles just do weird things, and all of a sudden you have refugee resettlement that was never really controversial before, and then a presidential candidate tweets about it, and all of a sudden it's a flashpoint. And so sometimes it's just things even as simple as that. And I think at a larger global scale, right, that uptick, those rising numbers every year, everyone kind of is aware of that in the background. And I think there's a sense that, like, we can't keep doing this forever. It's like a pressure valve. Like, that uptick of displacement every year is sort of like that annoying noise like a pressure cooker makes, And so everyone else, and especially in the global north, is kind of this increasing anxiety of like, what are we going to do when the dam bursts? Right? Where will all those people go? How will we take care of this? So I'll stop there. Those are a couple of different reasons why I think it's become so politicized and heightened. And there's probably tons more that I haven't even thought of. Any other questions?
I have another one.
Yeah.
Can you go back to the map that shows the countries that are accepting the most refugees?
This is where they're coming from. This is these that are accepting the most.
Okay, so one of the things you talked about was that most of the countries are neighbors to the states that are producing the refugees.
Mm-hmm.
How do you explain Germany?
Yes. Okay. Whoops. Wrong button. I'm really glad you pointed that out. Okay. So look, here's Germany up here, chilling in Northern Europe with 1.1 million plus refugees there. Okay. Germany, at the very beginning of the migration crisis, so-called, right, decided under the leadership of their chancellor, Angela Merkel, that they were going to lead out front of Europe. And while the rest of Europe was still kind of in this panic mode, Germany said, no, we are going to accept asylum seekers and hear their cases out. Come to Germany. That was basically she got on TV and was like, we will take you, come here, okay? And so this actually really kind of annoyed some of the other European states, because you can see, to get to Germany from Italy or Greece or Turkey, you have to go through a lot of other states. So It was kind of controversial because a lot of migrants were traversing Europe to get to Germany. But yes, they did ultimately accept massive amounts. In fact, per capita, Germany has, whoops, keep pushing the wrong button, the highest level of refugee hosting per any global nation in the global north. So of any of the most developed countries, Germany has the highest level of refugees in their country per capita. Now I ask you all, why do you think Germany might feel some sort of like moral compulsion to accept people who are being persecuted? Right, there's a sense in which, and I'm not a Europeanist, I'm not an expert in Germany, okay, so I don't want to overstep here, but I think it's safe to say there's a sense in which modern Germany, its psyche is like shaped by that past, and they feel this accountability to almost atone for what has happened, and so that motivated a lot of resettlement there. And it wasn't just the chancellor, it wasn't just Angela Merkel being like, come, and the rest of Germans being like, oh no. There was a massive outpouring of support from German citizens, especially at the beginning. That sort of went down over time, okay? But yes, Germany's been very supportive.
It was just because when I lived in Greece in 2017, I got to visit the migrant camp on Lesbos. And by visit, I mean stand outside the barbed wire. And they were literally putting migrants on planes to fly them to Germany. Because Greece wanted them out.
Yes, and I didn't want to talk about this today.
Sorry.
Because no, I do want to talk about it. I had to edit it out of the script because otherwise we'd be here all night. But Europe has this interesting thing called Dublin 2. Are you familiar? So in the EU, they have this rule where basically, if you come in and you put your foot in Germany first and you leave and try to claim asylum somewhere else, that country can say, no, sorry, you were in Germany or in Greece first, and send you back over and over and over again to your point of entry, okay? Which, if you remember, if I go back to, oops, maybe I went the wrong way. Well, maybe I didn't put it. But if you think about the geography of this, right, coming from this direction across the Mediterranean, that puts Greece and Italy at a disadvantage because they are geographically closest to North Africa and Syria, right? So they got overwhelmed at a certain point, and they were like, we cannot keep having you send all your Dublin 2 asylum seekers back here. Hence the planes, right? They're like, we're gonna, and there were other agreements kind of around Dublin 2, but that's also an interesting geography trick that countries do to.
And Greece was in a massive recession brought on by the Olympics, among other things, and Italy's in the same boat. But I mean, Greece just can't afford to keep them.
And most refugee hosting countries can't. We go back to this slide. This country right here, Jordan, Kingdom of Jordan, they are one of the only countries in this whole region of the Gulf states in the Middle East that has no oil reserves. None. Nada. Misfortunate geography, okay?
We're lucky.
We're lucky, depending on how you think of it. But in the past 20 years or so, especially, Jordan has struggled with development, okay? And let's also, just a side note about Jordan, look at who their neighbors are. Israel, so they have Palestinians that were displaced that live there. Iraq, so they have Iraqi refugees that live there. Syria, they have Syrian refugees who live there. Lebanon has been on and off civil warring since it was initiated. Okay, so they are geographically kind of at a place where they just end up hosting a lot of people, okay? And they've been very gracious to do so. But I will note, Jordan is not a signatory to the 1951 UN Convention. They are not obligated to do any of that, and yet they do. And in 2016, they spent 1/4 of their national budget on supporting refugees in their territory. That's in addition to the other money that the UN sends them. 1/4, 25% of their national budget. Can you imagine what the uproar in our country would be if we were like, okay, we're going to spend 25% of our national budget on asylum seekers. Ready? People would lose their minds, right? That's a huge sacrifice. It's a huge demonstration of hospitality. And so, again, that geography plays into a lot of that.
That actually transitions well into a question from the ether. What should we as nations be doing? What should we as citizens of signatory nations be doing to hold our leaders accountable to the treaties, conventions, protocols, etc. that we sign?
Woo! That's a great question. So what should we as nations, what should we as citizens do? Well, in our country, right, we have the pleasure and responsibility of being able to contact our elected representatives. And so Fortunately, okay, I didn't go into this as much, but with the new administration, we have kind of a new era of immigration policy. Now, that does not mean everything's rosy. President Biden's the best. President Trump is the worst. That's not what I'm saying. Okay, so don't hear me doing black and white like that. There's a lot of gray. But under President Biden, he has reinitiated a high refugee ceiling. Next year, we're set to resettle 125,000 refugees. Okay, so on this issue, the advocates have been heard, right? The administration is making decisions to support refugee resettlement. Now, as citizens, what you can do in that effort is that refugee resettlement is initiated by the federal government, but they only pay for arrival services for 90 days, 3 months, okay? Imagine if you were displaced, sent to another country where you'd never spoken the language, had never been before, and maybe had nobody that you even knew, and they were like, okay, cool, you have 3 months to learn the language, get a job, and that's it, okay? In our country, we have a network of what are called refugee resettlement agencies, and they rely extensively on donations and volunteers to help resettle people that come here. And so as we move out of this phase where resettlement has been low and we're trying to gear back up and get our system going again, resettlement agencies need your support. And I know a lot of the students here at Northwest are from Nebraska, from Kansas, from northern Missouri and Iowa. Refugees are resettled in all of those states, in Lincoln and Omaha and Des Moines, sites across Iowa, Kansas City, St. Louis, all over Kansas, okay? And if you are interested, there are places that you can get involved with and give money to or volunteer with. So that would be my first answer in most immediate need right now is that if we're going to resettle, if the US is going to step up and try to welcome 125,000 people this next year, the system's going to need some support.
Oh, more questions.
Oh, I got one back here.
All right, I'm not entirely sure how to ask this, but you hinted at it earlier. This trend of more and more refugees is continuing, and that it has a capacity. There is a limit to how high it can go. So do you think there is like an event, like a spark event that just like 9/11 would cause the trend to reverse? Like, and what would that be?
So just to make sure I'm hearing your question, do I think there is something that could happen that could cause those numbers to go down?
Yeah, like would there be another sort of catastrophe on scale with 9/11, you think, that could cause the global mentality to change and the trend to reverse?
I sure hope not, man. We've had enough significant global events here recently, in terms of like an event, 9/11 style event. Now, I don't know. Now, in terms of those high numbers of displacement, I'll go back to that slide. A lot of this is caused by the sense in which a lot of our modern wars are protracted. They just never end. They just go on and on and on. They might have a ceasefire, but they just keep going. Like, for instance, the Syrian Civil War. That's been going on for 10 years. And a lot of conflicts are like that nowadays. Like, there's never a truce and we're done fighting. Modern warfare is very messy. And so this creates situations where, like, is it possible for those refugees to ever go home? Like, what's the solution? Can they go home? Or should they be resettled in a third country, right? So it does create some questions. I don't know if there's anything that's going to lessen this number. I hope that some of these conflicts will resolve. I hope that resettlement will open back up and more countries will accept people. Of course, the hope for most of these people, right, is they want to go home. Most people that are resettled as refugees don't want to be resettled. Imagine if there was a conflict in Missouri, okay, or wherever you're from, okay? Some sort of war breaks out and you have to flee. Are you gonna be like, I wanna move to China and make a new life there? Or are you gonna be like, you know, I don't know how this is gonna go. Maybe I'll go to Minnesota and wait it out. Maybe I'll go to Canada and stay close to my family, wait it out and see. And I still really wanna go back to Missouri. Right? You're not going to be jumping up and down at the chance to be like, yes, what I've always wanted is to move to the other side of the world, right? So resettlement is not the first choice of many people, and it's not an option for everyone. So resettlement's not going to solve this. And unfortunately, a lot of scholars are questioning if climate change is going to exacerbate this as climate-induced migration, right? Where there's famines and massive hurricanes that are exacerbated by climate change and sea level rise. If you want to lose sleep Google the country of Kiribati in Oceania. It's an island nation that is losing its territory to sea level rise, and they project in the next 15 years there will be no country left. What do we do with an entire country of people that have been displaced due to climate change? I don't know.
Same
Either
things
just the
happening
world.
in the Gulf Coast. Houston's sinking.
Yeah, New Orleans, Florida, the Everglades, New York City. We are not, again, we're not insulated from these things, right? These questions are going to come home to roost in your generation, and we're going to have to answer them together.
So our political scientists have decided to weigh in. What role do private entities play in resettlement? Are there any private efforts?
Yes, I love this question. Okay, so this is actually what I research. So I was trying to keep this away from my my personal research, but so the U.S. resettlement system was established in the 80s, like right smack dab in the middle of neoliberal entrenchment, as the government was pulling back and saying, like, we don't want to be involved in more public service programs. So it's founded from the beginning on the principle of public-private partnership. And if you go and talk to people at resettlement agencies, they say that all day long. It's a public-private partnership. It's a public-private partnership. So there are a lot of private interests. The aside to that is the geography of refugee resettlement is crazy uneven. Okay, so for example, if you go to KC, you'll see 2 big resettling agencies that work with the government. You'll see some churches. You'll see some nonprofits, and maybe a couple of private entities like landlords or housing people that work together, okay? Go to a different city, like where I did my dissertation field work in Louisville, Kentucky. You will see a totally different arrangement of organizations, groups, churches, people, and private entities. So the answer is yes, private entities do help. However, there's no standardization of it, and as a result, the level of support is very uneven because the only thing that's guaranteed is the federal support. So these are the questions I'm trying to answer in my research.
I have another question.
Yeah.
Sure. Go ahead.
Oh yeah, John.
Like logistics wise, is there like a system in place to like move people from Central Africa to the United States or like on a large scale? Like, because most of them just walk across borders or like take rafts to the nearest continent. Like, is there like a system in place right now or like a good way to move people that far away, like thousands of miles?
That's a good question. The short answer is no. The long answer is, especially in your example, Central Africa to the US is not engaging in any sort of like migrant swapping or shared protection programs outside of our resettlement program. So to move people, they would have to be lucky enough to get selected for resettlement. They would have to clear all the background checks and the processing. It's a process that takes a year and a half if you're lucky. There's no delays. And then they resettle people by cases, by family, and they fly them over. So no, logistically, no. And the logistics of even organizing that individual resettlement, because of the security checks and background stuff, it does take a long time. And fun fact, refugees that are resettled in the United States are required to pay the government back for their plane ticket. Has anyone ever traveled internationally?
It's expensive.
You know it's expensive, and you also know it's real expensive if you buy the ticket the week before. That's how this works, right? They're waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting to process people, and once they get the clearance, they have to move on it. They want to get people on a plane ASAP before another executive order comes down or some weird thing pops up, okay? And so they buy tickets really short, so they end up paying like probably 3 or 4 times what they should have to pay for tickets. So it's a nightmare. Logistically, no, to answer your question, unfortunately.
Is the system designed to deter it? Well, you have to ask. I mean, if you're giving them that last minute, they're not providing them any financial assistance to pay for the plane ticket. And then we're sitting there turning around and saying, hey, by the way, you got to pay this back and you can't speak the language and you got a hard time finding a job. It seems like it's almost designed to make it harder and to deter them from wanting to do it.
It does seem like that.
Sorry.
That's what a lot of people who study this, a lot of scholars are questioning that, making that argument, like, right, who is this system protecting? Who is this helping? And, you know, the cynical side of me wants to dig deep into that. But I mean, to be fair, right, it's a good thing we have international laws protecting refugees. Without the Convention and Protocol, there would be nothing. Without resettlement, there would be no way to bring people, like there would be no system, right? So it's important that even as we think critically and think carefully about ways to do better, we protect what we have, because so often this is under attack. especially the last 4 years. A lot of us in this world are kind of like not quite ready to believe that we don't have to fight for the right to resettle just a couple thousand people a year, okay? So it's important that we protect what we have while looking to a better future and thinking about solutions of ways that can be done better. Thank y'all so much for your great questions and for coming. I really appreciate it. Thank you all. And on your spring break eve, it means a lot. Take my class.
Spring break needs to be in air quotes right now.
Yeah, spring break. Your spring long weekend. Your self-care day.
Thank you. I didn't spring. You have to put it